what you see way up in the sky. Making circles in the morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why. I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, 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 I can't break away. I can't break away. Oh, no, 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 I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Yeah, I am indeed re-rendering this every week, Gilly, because the names are going to change, and there's no way that I can do what I want to do with the intro and just have it be like the guys who were there last week. The names you saw tonight are the important names for this week. I will spell them all per Gilly's request as we get to each and every one of them. I have tried to balance the audio a little bit better for tonight so that we do not blast your neighbor's doors off when we go BRB. Nerd, yeah, but it's still worth it. Alright, so moving forward, each episode we're going to start with what Fix screwed up last week. And I did two major boo-boos last week that I want to make sure everyone gets the correct information on. The first one is about the 1 hour and 20-minute mark last week. We got into this thing where we kept saying Louis the 14th, Louis the 16th, and I crossed them up several times. So I want to make sure that we are clear on Louis XIV as the Sun King, very strong, domineering king who spent lavishly and tried to centralize everything in Paris and then Versailles. And then Louis XVI was the vacillating, no backbone, really wanted to do the right thing, intelligent guy, but just didn't have the force of will to get things fixed when it became critical. The second thing is, I'm going to go back a page and just make sure I get the name. I said Montesquieu was a member of the Parlement in Brittany, which is actually Reims is his capital, and he was actually a member of the Bordeaux Parlement. So it's a minor thing. It really doesn't change the statement that was made about his decentralizing balance of power philosophy coming from being a member of a parlement versus the ministry, but I did still want to correct it. So there we go. We'll start off with those, basically every week, just to make sure I check my own facts, and if someone says, hey, Fix, you screwed up, I will make sure I fix it. All right, so the other thing is I'm going to start saying this at the beginning of every stream. I'm not a historian. I'm just a student of history. Nothing that is made during this stream is to my own personal financial benefit. All your bits, subs, Streamloots packs you may choose to buy, that all goes to serve disabled American veterans. We donate that money once a month. Donated lots of money so far. I just want to get it out in front of anybody who's watching on YouTube that I just read a lot. And I've read a lot and listened to a lot, studied a lot. That's the only reason that I feel remotely qualified to talk about all this. So, what you see in front of you as we move into topic 1 tonight is a map of the French Parlement in 1789. Now, we're not at 1789 yet, but this is still the map you want to be talking about for probably the next 40 minutes. These different colored areas represent a different judicial responsibility for each of the central, meaning Paris's, and then provincial parlement. And if you go back to what we talked about last week, those parlement are the court of final appeal. So no matter what happens in the lines upon lines upon lines, lines, everywhere is lines, judicial, tax, theocratic districting that happened in France in this era, you could eventually get your case to your provincial or central parlement and have the case heard there, but it would take years. So there was originally just one, and it was Paris, and it covered all of France. So no matter where you were in France, about 100 years ago, you had to go to effectively the Supreme Court. You were going to the Paris Parlement. But eventually, these parlements were broken up into 13 provincial parlements. But there's still this thing where all the rules aren't written down, and at the end of the day, Paris's Parlement trumps everybody. So it kind of like they all feed into Paris, and the Paris Parlement is the grandest and greatest and bestest of all the parlements. So they could effectively seen that way, even though there isn't any hard, fast rule that says the Paris Parlement is more important than the Bordeaux Parlement. So the most triumphant, yeah, something along those lines. So they represent this bridge, and we talked about this last week in episode 1.1. They represent this bridge between the old sword nobility, those families who had been noble for a long, long time, and some of them were broke, and talked about gilding of the arms and etc. And then the new nobility, these new families who bought into being noble through office. And so there's this, they exist as this buffer for a while between these two groups of nobles, but they eventually become hereditary. Like there's this gradual transformation to all of these magisterial offices that sit in the Parlement becoming generational, meaning my daddy bought the office, I'll inherit the office. I don't really have to do anything to become a member of the Paris Parlement because my dad bought the seat. These seats were bought and sold, by the way. So a member of my family could have sold the seat before I was able to inherit it, and therefore I got gypped. They were property, and they were status symbols, just like every other little piece of privilege that existed in Ancien Regime France. So they comprise in these 13 parlements. There's about 1,000 to 1,200 people involved in them. That's the magistrates, the clerks. Just that there are about a grand, about 1,000 French people working in these high courts across France in the 1780s, and they see themselves as the protectors of justice and equality in France, but they're really not. They're just really good at selling that narrative to the third estate, and especially the more common people, the lesser educated people. We will defend you against an encroaching monarchy whose desire is to stomp on your freedoms so that they can rule over you as a tyrant. And all the Parlement was really up to was making sure that ministry, that they didn't come in and take the privileges of the aristocrats. They were really protective of these old privileges that they had inherited and bought and paid for over generations. But then they turned around and said, hey, you down there, goat farmer, I'm protecting you too, but not really. And they knew it. So they acted as this provincial check on the ministry, the central, ministry of the king, whomever was in charge of the monarchy. But we can talk about going back to to Count Richelieu, etc. But they acted as this check, so they could stop for a time when the ministry came out and said, this is a new law. Parlement would go, let me look at this new law. Let's all gather around and look at the new law. And they could issue what's called a remonstrance, which says, no, I don't think so. And they send it back to the ministry and say, here are all of these. Like that new special thing I gave number 98 right there, because it's important. Please welcome the most excellent vanquisher of public thirst, my very good friend, number 98. But they acted like this check to say, no, here's a remonstrance. We remonstrate this edict. You cannot register this with the Parlement, and it had to be registered with each Parlement to become law, because there was something wrong with it. They could demand a clear a clarification of areas they had problem with, like you must clearly define this process, make sure this is more detailed, or they could ask for specific pieces of the edict to be removed entirely. And they could basically filibuster on those grounds and say, this won't become law until those things are done. And so that creates this political confrontation where the ministry says, the king says, I want this law. And the parliament says, I don't think so. And they lock horns on it, politically and publicly. And you're entering an era in the 1760s, 70s, 80s, where this idea of public opinion really begins to matter. So the king had the final trump card. And I talked about the existence of this trump card when we lightly brushed over the parliament last week. He could conduct what is called a lit de justice, which is just spelled justice, right? But I'm trying to pronounce it in best French as I can. And what a lit de justice was the king going back to the parliament and saying, I don't think so. I'm not changing anything, or I'm not changing pieces I don't want to change. And I am enforcing this and forcibly registering this via my royal will. And it was a really funny ceremony. I mean, it involved the king sitting on a bed of pillows, and it was really this grand, just crazy ceremony to conduct the lit de justice. But the king didn't want to do that because it looked really bad, right? If you are defending yourself from a group of 13 judiciaries that want to pretend that they are protecting the people from a tyrant, the very last thing you really want to do from a public relations front is act like a tyrant, which is what the lit de justice comes off as. Even though in the, quote, absolute monarchy of the Ancien Regime in Louis the 15th and 16th time, they still had to happen because the parlements were obstructionary. They were protecting their own privilege. They were not looking for the best interests of the nation. They were looking out for their own best interest. So that's like when we talked about the raw, naked self-interest of some individuals. The parlement is the greatest example of a group of individuals as this ticking time bomb in the finances is going off that really didn't care. They looked around and said, as long as we're okay, we're not caring about anybody else. So they battled with the monarchy, but they also battled with the royally appointed intendants, which are those governors, those provincially appointed, executive governors of each region. They would fight with those intendants over the law and the rules and the tariffs and the tax collection, and just as hard as they would fight against the monarchy and the ministry. So have this judiciary, and if you continue to think of the American concept of the three branches, where you have the executive and the legislative and the judiciary, there is no legislature. There is just an executive and a judiciary fighting back and forth politically over what is and can and cannot be law. And remember, we talked about last week that this is supposed to be an absolute monarchy where the king or queen in that concept can just drive through and say, this is what I will to be law. It is law. But you can see in this system that that's not true at all. And it's really important. And I know I've already said it, but these parlements were exceedingly good at the PR game. They were very good at pointing to their actions as protection for the common people. They could spin it and frame it in the same way that things politically get spinned today, in such a way that made the monarchy look bad anytime the monarchy wanted to dig their heels in. So they started to act out. These parlements were brought to heel under Louis XIV. Louis XIV really centralized the entire apparatus of the Ancien Regime and solidified it. And he was so convinced of his majesty and had so very much won the PR game of his own divinity as a king, his own God-appointed divinity, that he was able to bring all of the parlement to heel. But as Louis XV comes into office, he had talked about how he really just wasn't that interested in being king. His ministers had to repetitively convince him to come forth, conduct the lit de justice in order to overturn the remonstrances of all of the parlement, because as Louis XIV died, judiciary came out of its shell and started to say, I don't think so. We're not doing this for another generation. And so those actions began to chip away at the public opinion of the monarchy. They started to see that message coming from the Parlement. This is a tyrant. Ministry acts as a tyrant. And so, as we go from Louis XV to Louis XVI, that has been an entire reign's worth of this gradual sanding down of that monarchy's public oppression. So that by the time we get to Louis XVI, the Parlement is, from a generation of practice, ready to fight. And then you roll in Louis XVI, who is the least confrontational king of France in 200 years, who is going to bend with the wind. So the purpose of this first section, talking about the power of the Parlement and the actions that they have taken to set up that fight, because it's going to come. We talked last week about this completely crazy setup of taxes and legal areas jurisdiction. Welcome in, Dustin. So all of those problems financially and legally start to come to a head in the late 1760s. And that's a fight that we're going to talk about here in a moment. This is the last piece of background, by the way. The story that you've all been asking me to start telling is going to start in just a minute. But I want to do a couple things first. First, CF Live, Dracodai, Mr. Land Diggity, Rocket, and Gilly. Thank you for the hosts on the way in. I truly appreciate it, and I really do appreciate everyone's support. Feedback from last week was very good. I had people. I caught CF's comment during a BRB about the audio balancing, and I spent some time trying to get it right. I'm sure it's not completely right, but it's not going to blow your windows out this. I also took some comments from people not even watching live that contacted me just because they know me and said they had learned a lot, their kids had learned a lot, and that's really the I want to continue to tell this story. Who needs windows? I want to tell this story of how this series of connected events begins the definition of the world we live in. And so I really just appreciate everyone continuing to give me those pokes and say, hey, maybe you went too deep into the weeds there, and make sure that the sound's not too loud so that people can hear you speak. So anyway, that's my extremely grateful just feedback to you, that I was really apprehensive about doing this simply from the perspective that, would people be interested? Seems you are, because a lot of you are back already this week. The other thing is, we talked about a long time ago about heavy metal history, right? And number 98 said last week, I thought this was the history of heavy metal, but no. It's never been intended to be that. It's been intended to be history told, when possible, through heavy metal. Forgotten that you even asked about the spelling of Henry. Yep. There was a lot of questions last week, and I know that my turnaround on some of those questions was kind of like, nope, and it's because I'm trying to keep a flow. So don't think I'm smacking you down either when you say something that's wrong. If you have a question, put a question mark at the end so I know you're not trying to make a statement. But anyway, this whole series was originally intended to help guide through the amazingness that is the story of our shared history as a people, and then combine that with music. And then, Twitch made that a little bit more difficult. But I don't save my VODs to Twitch, and I'm cool with not making money off YouTube. So, coincidentally, there is no great heavy metal song about the French Revolution. No one. There's a good one about Napoleon, and we'll play it when we get there. But coincidentally, a band that we listen to a lot, that we use for our intros for all of the Darkest Dungeon stuff, they released a song this week that is about an event that happens in the late 1760s in France, believe it or not. The song is called The Beast of Gévaudan, and it is about this area in France right around down here. Mountainous region down here. It's a former province. It's called Gévaudan. Powerwolf released this song called The Beast of Gévaudan, and what it's about is this specific time frame where a mythical beast that was called the Beast of Gévaudan was killing people, and it became like into the stories of werewolves and vampires and this whole superstitious era. And the reason that this song is relevant to the story I want to tell is because of the concept of that this rural fear of what is happening that is outside of people's control. So what happens is in 1764, the first person is killed by this unknown beast, and it was a 14-year-old girl. Over time, more people are killed, and the king eventually sends professional wolf hunters down into the area to kill the Beast of Gévaudan. And in 1768, the beast is eventually, 1767, the beast is eventually killed. The beast is eventually killed, and it's a wolf. But the real story is that it was probably a lot of wolves, because wild wolves were a problem in France in the time. And it's how that normal event, well, that normal sequence of events, in an uneducated people who are still very superstitious, before they're not attached to the Enlightenment principles of evaluating things with, evidence and thought, and that skepticism that's a part of that the scientific revolution of the era. It is that element of this story that's important, because there's going to be a period of time very shortly in our storytelling, like next week or maybe the week after the Bastille falls, where this fear in the populace of what's just over the horizon in the countryside will become very important. So, because it connects that feeling and that thought, it's relevant to what we're talking about. So, to give you the very first ever heavy metal song that is relevant to our discussion of the French Revolution. You can see in red, that's where Gévaudan is. There will be lyrics.
From heaven, the seventh of creatures. Beast of Gévaudan, for the wrath of God to come, came to sanction the mass and the
remember to clonk that follow button.
There you go. The very first song, and I did mute myself in case I hit something. The very first song that has made its way into heavy metal history has to do with this fear concept, this unknown, this we can explain things with common sense, observation, application of reasonable skepticism, or we can jump as a people to conclusions about what's going on. And I could have saved this song for the early 1790s when it would have been relevant from the fear concept, but it's relevant from a time position right now because we're going to move into the last Lord Chancellor of France. And I'm going to leave that graphic up for just a second so you guys can kind of relay where that red area, that red old province is of Gévaudan to where the map of the Parlement. Take it down in just a second. But we're going to move into the next topic. And this episode, by the way, should be a little shorter, maybe, depending on questions and comments, etc., than last week's, which was massive foundational information. But the story of the French Revolution, as told by Fix, now that you have all of the necessary, basic information, starts now. Meet René Nicolas de Mapeau. And for Gilly, that's M-A-U-P-E-A-U or M-A-U-P-O-U, depending on how you want to Americanize that. But he became Lord Chancellor of France in 1768, so the year after the Beast of Gévaudan was killed. And that's the segue. He came up through the Paris Parlement, so he was one of these guys who was fighting against the tyranny of the monarchy. He inherited his seat from, his family, just like everybody else at that point in time. But becoming Lord Chancellor flips him, puts him into the ministry. And Lord Chancellor is the highest judicial official in France. And this appointment, his face says, "Are you done yet? I have to take a crack." This appointment of this staunch member of the Paris Parlement was applauded by all of the Parlement across all of France. They're like, this is our guy. Look at this. We're going to get this guy into the ministry, and he's going to fight our fight for what we want from the inside. Problem is, that's not what happened. Mapeau took the job seriously. He took his job advocating for the king seriously. So, in a sense, he's a traitor to the members of the Paris, or all the Parlement. But what he does is he basically gets into the job, looks back at the Parlement and says, you guys are doing it all wrong, even though the system that was in place yesterday is what got him to the appointment of Lord Chancellor. How do we spell his name? There are two spellings. M-A-U-P-E-A-U is how I have it in my notebook. It is also possible to spell it M-A-U-P-O-U. But the full name is René Nicolas de Mapeau, or also René Augustin Nicolas de Mapeau. But Mapeau is how I'm going to refer to him, because that's a whole lot of French words to say, and I'm just going to mess them up if I keep saying them over and over. But here's Mapeau, Lord Chancellor of France, the very last one. Very last time there would be a Lord Chancellor of France. The office was abolished in the 1790s. He spearheaded the appointment of this gentleman, Joseph Marie Perret, as Controller General in 1769. So Mapeau was appointed Lord Chancellor in 1768, and he works hard to get this guy, Joseph Marie Perret, who I will just call Terre, appointed as Controller General. Controller General being the office that is in charge of the finances. Lord Chancellor is the judiciary. Controller General is the finances. Definitely not one of the Montesquieu's de la Gare. Hi, Fist, welcome in, by the way. I saw you talk during the music. Hope you're enjoying yourself. So, these two work together, and I can bounce back and forth, but Mapeau is the more central figure in the next piece of the narrative. But Mapeau and Terre work together, starting in 1770, when Mapeau is not only Lord Chancellor, but becomes First Minister, which is the concept of Prime Minister that we understand in most parliamentary systems in Europe today. He becomes the First Minister, the head of the executive on behalf of the monarch. And Mapeau and Terre begin to take aim through edict at the noble tax privileges. Now, remember last week we talked about how all this land, 43% of the land, was owned by nobles, the second estate, and the first estate, the church. They start aiming at the fact that they don't pay any taxes on those lands. And they look at the way in which taxes are farmed. We talked about the archaic system that goes back to the Roman Empire, where a company bids on how much of the tax burden they can actually collect, and then whatever they collect past that is profit. They start aiming at these two things. They want to reform the way in which France gathers the tax revenue and who pays the tax revenue. The problem is that the people who aren't paying their fair share are the people in the Parlement, and people just like them. These nobles of privilege don't have to pay their land tax, the taille. So the Parlement is naturally opposed to the actions of Mapeau and Terre. So Mapeau starts issuing decrees that begin to hinder the abilities of the Parlement to obstruct the will of the king and their own ability to even correspond between each of the regional parliaments. It basically makes it so that all their communications have to come through the ministry and then go back out to the parliament so that, he could open up their mail and read it, among other things. But he's adding weight and hindrance to the day-to-day ability of the parliament to operate. So guess what? These are edicts, right? Mapeau is saying, you, the Paris Parliament, cannot do these things. And what do? They say, here is the remonstrance, right back in your face, bro, because we don't like any of this. And Mapeau then kicks off some pretty earth-shaking decisions. He starts to... Well, first he goes to the king. At this time, it's still King Louis XV, because remember, King Louis XV doesn't die until 1774, and it's still 1769-70, right? So he goes to King Louis XV and says, hey, those guys aren't doing what I think is in the best interest of your kingdom. Yes, you're old and disconnected, so just trust me. And the king's like, sure. So King Louis XV starts issuing lit de justice to overcome the remonstrances of the Parlement. And this, what becomes ground-shaking, glass-shattering approach to the Parlement from Mapeau, starts to go into action. And it was huge. He wasn't taking aim at, this is a percentage of taxes that you will pay from this point forward. He was saying the way in which you operate as a judiciary is going to change. Yes, he very much had the ear of the king, and he was an effective leader. But remember, you still have to remember, this is a guy who 3 years ago was on the other side of this conversation. He was heading up the argument from the Parlement's perspective that they were fighting tyranny. And now he is enacting that perceived tyranny from the position of the ministry. So he was in with the king to his appointment he was the last Lord Chancellor of France and then became First Minister. Became First Minister / Prime Minister, to put it in a term most people will get, in 1770. So Mapeau, with his lit de justice in hand, starts to dismantle the operations of the Parlement as they know it. And when the Parlement continues to say, we don't like this, we're not going to do this, the king start issuing what are called lettres de cachet, which effectively are written edicts from the king that are binding against an individual. So it trumps he can't issue broad sweeping laws via a lettre de cachet, but he can say, in these instances, you there, members of the Paris Parlement who are acting seditiously toward what is now registered law, you are exiled from Paris. Go here and live there for a while and cool your heels. And Mapeau gets Louis XV to issue these lettres de cachet, and starts throwing the ministers of the parlements out of their hometowns. Says, get out. He's doing this because he wants to set forth an entirely new judicial system for France. And if you go back in time, it's needed, right? We talked about the Generalité and the provinces and the just myriad of lines everywhere is lines that just make it so that one person standing next to another person is not subject to the same laws. The intent of Mapeau here is to reform that system, but he knows he can't do it with the Parlement standing right in front of him saying, anything you send to us, we're just going to say no to, because it's now our mission to just reject anything the ministry sends our way. We become obstructionists. Does this remind you, especially my American viewers, of the way something works today? It's a very concerning parallel for those of us who read and study history. When the position of one powerful element becomes obstruction for the sake of obstruction, then the prerogative of those in more power becomes, well, the only way forward here is to blow that up, because we can't talk and we can't come to some semblance of common sense. Then the only thing we can do is say, you're out. We can pull you out of there, and we're going to. So remember, the Parlement is very, very good still at saying, oh, look at Mapeau. Look at Mapeau. He is a tyrant. He is ripping us, your protectors of liberty, out so that the monarchy can act as it will. Oh, look at the lettre de cachet they just sent to all of us. What a tyrannical piece of paper that the king can just decree that I'm not allowed to live in my home anymore. Let's not worry about the fact that you are not allowed to leave the land in which you are born because you're still a serf. We're talking about us here at the Parlement, not you down there, and look at the tyrants. And that's the story they would sell. So, the entire Parlement of Paris eventually gets exiled from Paris. They get sent to a city that's not really important historically. The Parlement of Bordeaux also rebels against the decrees of Mapeau on behalf of the king. We have not even begun to guillotine anyone yet. But, thank you for mentioning that, 5/5. There's a new channel point reward called Off with His Head. That if you go look right now, you can use the guillotine. But the guillotine will not come around until the Reign of Terror, which is in the early 1790s. Right now we are in the late 1760s, early 1770s. Whereas no one's gone and found the off with his head button yet. There. So, what happened here? There we go.
Yes, I'm excited about the guillotine.
There we go. Surf was really excited about the guillotine. So, Mapeau, now that he's exiled these members of the Parlement from France, from Paris, and Bordeaux, and other places, he begins to work on this completely restructured judiciary system, which is basically designed to relegate the Parlement to nothing but a old man's club that deals with nothing except for disputes that are greater than 200,000 livres, which means they're basically a large claims court. He's trying to take their power away and push them off the side and say, hey, look, you're still judges. You're over here handling disputes between yourselves and no one else, because who the hell has property worth 200,000 livres except you guys? But at the same time, he sets up this new provincial Parlement system that is based in magistrates who are appointed by, wait for it, the king. So that means by Mapeau, which means Mapeau is looking to create a court system where it's stacked with allies. And the funny thing is that while the Parlement and the magistrates and the clerks and those who work there were obviously almost in open rebellion from the position of, we don't want this, you're taking away all of our power, the Paris legal community said, this is great, because finally somebody is trying to make sense of this mishmash of lines everywhere is lines that they had to deal with. So the Paris bar says, yes, let's go along with Mapeau. He's doing something that needs done. Might not agree with the way, but it needs done. Yes. Those of you that want to read the sources, there's your link. There are no new sources because this basically 3 episodes. But the Paris Bar and the lawyers. Remember who the lawyers are. They're not the aristocracy. They're not the nobles. The lawyers are the upper middle class, the bourgeoisie, the third estate. So the leadership, the smart, educated people in the third estate look at the ministry and say, that guy's doing stuff we want. These nobles and aristocrats are standing in the way of it. And so the bar and the lawyers start to side with the ministry. The Enlightenment made these lawyers happy to work in a system that promised to be more just, more equitable, less obstructionist, and simpler for the everyday people, because these lawyers were members of the third estate, the same third estate that represents the farmer and the unskilled worker and the skilled guild member. They still have more kinship with those people because they're part of that same group, that 97% that makes up the third estate. So they liked what Mapeau was doing. They liked the fact that he was trying to take a hammer to a system that was busted, just break it, throw it aside, and then start drawing a new one. So Mapeau, though, creates a ton of influential enemies, right? You can't do what he's trying to do and not make people really mad, right? He creates a ton of enemies. And year over year of his ministry, leading up to 1774, when Louis XV dies, support for him and what he's doing to the Parlement starts to fade. And the Parlement still keep up that really good public PR fight over the course of years against what he's doing, because that's their only wedge. They can only sit there and say, yeah, we're out of power, but look at this. They keep issuing edicts that no one can challenge, and eventually it's going to mean you. Now it means us, but right, sooner or later it can mean you. It can mean the way in which they tax you. I mean the way in which they use your equipment and make you use specific people. Oh wait, they're already doing this, but still they can make you do it. And it really wasn't the ministry making those things, it was nobles. Eventually, Louis XV died in 1774, which puts Louis XVI on the throne, ripe old age of 19 years. Still successfully the first king of France who's not an infant or a toddler in, 150 years. But Louis XVI, as we have talked about so many times, did not have the will for a public fight. And even though they were out of power, the Parlement still had the people in their pocket, and there was mounting public pressure to stop what Mapeau was doing. So very shortly in, like months into his reign, Louis XVI says, Mapeau, you're out. And he takes Terre with him, the Controller General. And so all the work these two guys were doing, trying to reform the judiciary, trying to reform the way in which taxes were collected, and the noble privileges that were under attack from the way that which Mapeau and Terre approached the dismantling of the Parlement, it gets a big fat reset button hit on it in 1774. Yes, Mapeau was still in charge up until the point that Louis XVI took power. But very quickly after Louis took power, he said, you're gone, Mapeau. You're gone, Terre, because the people outside are yelling, and I really don't know how to deal with that because they're mad, and I don't like people who are mad at me, so you're the source of them being mad at me. You're gone. And he reverted the entire system of the Parlement, their power to do remonstrances, everything. So turn the clock back to 1767, and we're right back where we started, because the very first, very important example where Louis XVI says, I just don't have the backbone for any sort of fight. So Louis XVI appoints this man, Robert Jacques Turgot, spelled Turgot. And we are going to get into something called physiocracy, which is a philosophy of economics that Turgot and several other people, including Voltaire, subscribe to. It is going to mess some stuff up. Turgot's going to fight a good fight, and we're going to find out about that good fight, rooted in the ideas of physiocracy. Back. We're going to take a break. Going for about 45 minutes. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of notes left. So maybe 3 hours again. We'll see. But thanks for hanging out. We'll be right back. I really appreciate, by the way, that anonymous gift sub on the way in. I hope the individuals who received that enjoy that. I don't know who it was. I can thank you. We'll be back in just a few minutes. We'll pick up with the first.
Hey, Death.
If it isn't a wild stallions.
We will pick up with the first controller general of the reign of Louis XVI, on Robert Jacques Turgot, when we come back from break. I'll talk to you guys in a few minutes.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Let's rock!
Rock indeed. All right. Welcome back. Hopefully you're back at your seats with your notebooks open. Before we move on to Turgot, I mentioned that Mapeau was the last Lord Chancellor, head of the judiciary from a ministerial perspective, France, and he retained that position when he became First Minister. When he was dismissed by Louis XVI, he refused to give up the position of Lord Chancellor, and no other Lord Chancellor was ever promoted to the post. The office was abolished in early portion of the revolution, which we're very, very quickly counting down to now. So he was the very last Lord Chancellor of France. You're still 2 rooms away. Run! But Turgot. Henri Robert Jacques Turgot would serve as Controller General of France from 1774 until 1776. He takes over France at a very critical point in time. And it's only 2 years. They're super critical. He, first of all, subscribes to an economic theory called physiocracy, which sits in between the classic concept of mercantilism and the classical liberalism, which Adam Smith is working on in Scotland right now. But physiocracy believes that the wealth of a nation is rooted in the land, in agriculture. And everything else is just an offshoot. So the ability of a nation to produce from the position of farm is everything. Concept of physiocracy. And it was a modernization of the ideas that used to be mercantilism. He and others, which we will call physiocrats, believed that the guild system was this anachronistic, horrible way to approach any sort of way to exchange goods and work. And he thought that the indirect taxes that existed all over France, so we talk about again, excuse me, the lines that are everywhere, that makes no sense, that all had the tariffs that existed between them, as we talked about last week. He believed, very rightfully, that this system of internal tariffs really hurt the French consumer because all it did was jack up prices, especially on bread. And bread is about to become super. Bread, we think about, what do we eat every day? Everyone's like, oh, don't eat bread because, high in carbohydrates and it's going to put pounds on you, and it certainly has for me in the past. But bread was the core staple of the French commoner diet. The thing they ate the most was bread, which explains why croissants are so good. But the internal tariffs on flour, the transportation of flour to bakers, raised the price of flour, which raised the cost of creating bread, which raised the cost of buying bread. And Turgot is very correct in his desire to set this trade of grain free. Freeing the grain trade is going to become this big thing for several controllers general, and idea of freeing this up so that there are not set prices for grain. Internal tariffs on grain go bye-bye, so that the French peasants can afford grain. Sure, there's going to be growing pains as the whole concept of supply and demand sort of equalizes, but it'll be okay over time. That's the theory behind getting rid of these. So he tested his theory back when he was intendant of Le Mans in 1761, and he was in the post of intendant, which is that royally appointed governor of Le Mans, 1761 to 1774, when he was put into the ministry as Controller General.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
I will. Make sure you do too. If you're enjoying history, make sure you hit that follow button. I'd appreciate it. So he pursued across the board cuts, expenses. He looked at the books and said, holy crap, we're not making anywhere near enough money in terms of tax revenue to cover all the expenses that not only we have, but we inherited from 2 prior regimes, especially Louis XIV, that have just crippled us. We can't pay the interest on our loans, let alone pay the necessary monies to keep everyday things going. And he looks down the road and goes, this is coming to this whole notion that we are financially crippled by our own system, own inability to generate revenue correctly and collect that revenue. It's going to be a problem. Sees it. Terre saw it too, but Terre was more working alongside Mapeau to do a grander idea. But the moment that the Parlement comes back to power was the end of the notion of judicial reform in France. So Turgot begins to focus on the financial reform. So he starts to go at the pensions and favors that the king and queen dish out to their friends, along with all of the noble privilege. You're not paying tax on land, etc., etc. He begins to do the same thing that Mapeau did, going after the privileges and money of the aristocracy, the nobility. You're attacking not their power, but their money, their status, and there begins building of enemies against Turgot. But again, the big thing he wanted to do was set the grain trade free. He wanted to remove the set price on grain and bread. Mapeau too, except we're talking money now, finances this year. He wanted to remove the entire internal regulatory structure, which forced the farmer to sell below the value of their work. Meaning, because of the tariffs, because they were forced to move grain from one place to another in order to meet the needs of people. They were having to sell their grain through all those tariff systems at a value that was less than how much it cost them to grow the grain. Remember, some of these people are still intended as serfs, can't move, they can't change what they do. This is what they do. So he's trying to strip all that out. He's trying to get rid of those set prices. He's trying to get rid of those regulatory structures, those tariffs that make the cost of doing business problematic for the farmer. And then he believed that if the grain was sold where and when it was needed for whatever price it could get, that it would lead to the normalization of wages and prices that reflected the worth of the French economy truly. The consumer, farmer, and the landowners would prosper. And in theory, that's how free trade works. That's how supply and demand works. The problem is, Turgot didn't get that you can't just walk up to a system like this. Even an economy in the late 18th century is complex. You cannot walk into the way that it's run, burn it down and say, be free everybody, and assume it will work well enough for everyone so that no one objects to it. So, he launched this initiative pretty much as soon as he got in office, because again, he'd been experimenting with these ideas in Le Mans for over a decade. The problem is, the year he decided to launch his free the grain policy for France, there were extremely disproportionate harvests in France, meaning some areas had really, 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 really good, you're close, Rocket. Some areas had really, really, really good harvests, and other places didn't have very good harvests at all. So you have this, and we'll go over here just so we have a map. Some parts of Paris had really good. Let's say the pink area had really, and this isn't accurate, but let's just say the really good harvests were in the pink area. And the really bad harvests were in the brown and green and pea green and blue and orange areas, right? So that led farmers to price gouge because they said, I could either make what the market says my grain is worth in this very rich region that just had a fantastic harvest, which means our grain is worth crap because the market is flooded. Or I could take my grain into the pink area where it's worth more. Unless you, sir, who lives next door to me, would like to pay the same amount of money for the grain that they're going to pay me up in the pink area. Nelly, thank you very much for the 10 months. Very much appreciate it. So, these farmers are the first problem for Turgot because they look around and said, I can make a buck, which is what a capitalist society is based in the free market, free trade system, internal trade system at least. They said, citizens of Bordeaux, we have lots and lots of grain, which is worth crap, and you could get it super cheap, but I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm going to move it because I now can, because the system of tariffs that make it impossibly expensive to move it there are gone. I'm going to move it all up into the pink area to Paris because I can get more there. This led, again, to farmers' price gouging. It led to wages, without the wages rising, right? So the people who lived around Bordeaux were now facing farmers that said, I know that the market says my grain is worth, 10 livres a pound or whatever. Number I don't have is, but worth 40 a pound in Paris. You can pay me 40. If a person that works in Bordeaux says, you know what, we haven't seen all these effects yet of Turgot's changes and I'm still making dirt and I can't afford it. And so the freeing of the grain trade becomes extremely unpopular with the French peasants whose primary source of food is that grain trade. So the notion of setting it free is free markets are good. No internal tariffs are good. The idea that if you had gone long enough in a system, those wages would come up because that is how supply and demand works is sound. But the fact that there was massive inequality in the harvest, very first year that Turgot tries to do this, sets everyone against it. And off in the distance, there are people, other economic people, who are looking at what Turgot is doing and saying, that's bad. And they start writing about it and they start setting themselves up to be the opposite. We're going to get to one of this. Rocket's right. I don't know if it's cheat in this case versus the rules existed in such a way that I can take an advantageous position. The farmers chose to do so. Probably because their landowners told them to do so. So, peasants believed that the king was responsible for a concept called the moral economy. That the king, at the end of the day, was father protector. He should step in and make sure these terrible farmers who are price gouging us, it is price gouging. It's like buying gas in Texas and driving it to the east coast of the United States a few weeks ago, and that pipeline shut down and said, you can have a gallon of gas for $35. That's exactly what they're doing. But these peasants believed in this concept called the moral economy. They looked to the king and said, do something. The king looked down and said, I don't know, you're right, and this is bad, but I don't want to get into an argument with the richer, more powerful. So back to much of a fine. That leads to the very aptly named Flour War. Flour, not FLOW. The Flour War of 1775. It's an uprising that took place in April and May of 1775. It's set. Let's see here. What's my note 6? I can't read what I wrote. Yep. Landowners, bakers, anyone who appeared to be unjustly profiting from the free grain trade, the peasants rose up and said, the king's not going to do something. Okay, so the mic's not picking everything up, so I'll lean down further and speak louder because that means my gate's not picking it up. So, the Flour War of 1775. The peasants rose up, April, May 1775, and said, the king isn't doing what he's supposed to do. We're going to do something about it. And it really is the first concept of a mob uprising in France. They believed, the peasants of France believed, that the landowners and the farmers had entered into a pact, which they dubbed the Famine Pact. They believed there was an actual plan from the aristocratic landowners and the landowning farmers to drive the price of bread up intentionally, even though it was simply a ripple effect of freeing the grain trade and the system of free trade, tariffless internal free trade and supply and demand just kind of working itself out. But the peasants, they're doing this on purpose. They're trying to starve us. And this concept that the people were being purposefully starved by the richer amongst them is a concept that will repeat it. Bakeries were looted in Paris. Rioters were outside of Versailles at that point, demanding action from the king. And guess what? Louis, because he now had a mob outside of his door, said, I'll do something. Because the most recent thing that knocked on his door and caused him a problem is right there. It's no longer the rich people that are behind them. It's the people right at his gate. And he says, yep, we'll do something. He sends troops out to quell the rioting, but he also dismantles Turgot's efforts in part of freeing this grain trade up and said, we have to go back to a system where people pay a set price. The bread is sold for this much in Bordeaux and this much in Paris and this much in Reims and this much in Grenoble. And it appeases the peasants. It still leaves the farmers in a place where sometimes, depending on the yield of their harvest, the value of their grain per bushel isn't worth the amount it costs to produce it. But it does quell the riots and the flour war, which is really a fancy name for massive uprising of broke and starved peasants for the basic sustenance they need, comes to a quick end in 2 months. And we're now in May 1775. Guess what's happening around this time in America? Anybody who studied American history, any idea what's happening in the springtime of 1775, which is where we are right now in our story? Well, revolution is a very broad term. Can we be more specific? What's happening? Because the Declaration of Independence isn't signed. No, specific. Don't change the word. You just go from revolution to rebellion. What event is occurring in America, in North America, in 1775? Big party? That's already happened. Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre have already taken place. The first shots at Lexington and Concord, the shots heard around the world, according to American history, are occurring in North America, in Massachusetts, right around now. And I'm speaking generally, but it parallels in with the idea that French peasants just rose up a little bit, and colonial peasants in North America they're not rising up anymore. They've been rising up for a while, and the irregular army of the colonial militias have actually shot at British regulars. The British are coming. Yep, that's what's happening. Paul Revere and his famous ride, etc., etc. But shots are exchanged at this point in North America. And you might be like, why the hell is he talking about North America? It's going to matter. We talked about last week how the American Revolution is not the great domino. How it's not this thing that everyone said, oh, look at them over there in America, we should do the same thing. It's not that. But it certainly has an effect in France. Not because people look at it and go, what are they doing over there? We should do the same thing. Because the ministry of France says, what are they doing over there? Oh, look at them. They're going to really mess with the British. We should get in on that. Except Turgot doesn't believe it. He doesn't believe at all that that France should get involved in the American Revolution. So Turgot hangs on for a while. He is opposed in his views on the American Revolution by Charles Gravier, the Comte de Varenne. And I'm just going to call him Varenne because that's how he is more colloquially referred to in history books. And that is spelled Vergennes for Gilly. Vergennes has been the head foreign minister of France through both Louis XV into Louis XVI's regime. He is the most trusted advisor of Louis XVI. And Vergennes advocates heavily that France get involved in the American Revolution for a couple of reasons. He believes, like everyone who has ever looked at a potential war, he looked at it and said, Crackle Jacks, welcome in. Vergennes looks at what's going on in America and says, you know what, we should get into this because it'll be quick and it'll be cheap. Best of all, we can embarrass the British, who we just got embarrassed by in the 7 Years' War and had 100 Years' War with. We can get back at them. So if I am in the French ministry in 1775, 1776, when Turgot eventually is replaced, I'm Turgot. I'm looking at the French books and going, what? You want to send troops and spend money on? We can't afford that. Turgot's right. Turgot is absolutely right. France had no business getting into the American Revolution financially, but from a political, let's look further to the east, to Europe, and say to our European neighbors, we are still a power. Vergennes convinces Louis XVI, who at this point is 21 years old, and says, let's go. It takes some time, but France eventually does come in on the side of what would soon become the United States of America. And as an American, thank you very much, because if France hadn't come into the war, there probably wouldn't be an America. Because the French blockade forces the British to evacuate Philadelphia and retreat back to New York, and it changes the dynamic of everything in the North American Revolutionary War. But if I'm French, I'm looking at that historically and going, what were you doing? There's no way we can afford it. So, we'd probably still be Brits. A fair chance we might be Brits. So, in May 1776, so fast forward a year. We've gone from May 1775 and the end of the Flower War to May 1776 and the approaching Declaration of Independence from the United States. So France isn't in the war yet in North America, but they're going to be. Turgot is forced to resign. Turgot is replaced by a person who I swore to God I would mention, and I still didn't write down the freaking name in my notes, did I? Swear I did. Well, let's talk about it real quick. He is replaced by a gentleman named Jean-François Joly de Fleury. And that is spelled Fleury. And if you've watched hockey, you already know how to spell it. Fleury inherits a financial... He inherits the end of the breakup of the freeing of the grain trade. He inherits the beginning of the revolutionary period with the United States. It's a mess. And the dude does as well as he can for a year, but he lasts exactly 1 year. We enter this period now where the idea of enlightened despotism, that concept where these Enlightenment thinkers wanted there to be a strong central monarch, talked about this last week, that's going to do right by the people through the force of his will, using common sense and Enlightenment philosophies. We move out of that era of these controllers general and ministers who have actively been trying to enact reform along those lines, and into an era of thinking in the French ministry, which is pretty much summed up by, well, if we don't look at it, nothing's wrong. And enter in one of those individuals who looked at what Turgot was doing and looked at the free grain trade and started to set himself up as the alternative, antithesis, the guy who had all of the answers in the opposite direction, Jacques Necker. Necker. Necker becomes not Controller General because he can't become Controller General. He becomes Director General of Finances of France in 1777. And at this point, France's tipping point into getting into the Revolutionary War. It'll be about, 6 months. And at that point, from this point forward, you should just consider the fact that France is in the Revolutionary War with the United States. They're racking up the loan debt necessary to conduct a war that is not quick and is not cheap. You have to remember that France is not only fighting in New England, but all along the U.S. southern coast and in the Caribbean against the British, none of which is cheap. It's about this time that another young Frenchman is getting seriously involved with George Washington's camp, named the Marquis de Lafayette, by the way. So, Necker, Act 1 of Jacques Necker. And I mean Act 1 because if you had to highlight names that were super important as we've gone, obviously you highlight Lafayette, you would have highlighted Talleyrand last week, you've highlighted Louis XVI. This name you should get your highlight out for because Necker is going to hang around a couple of times. He's going to come back a couple of times. But Necker spent his time during the Turgot financial ministry looking at Turgot and saying, what are you doing? Of course we should get into the American Revolution because it'll be quick and cheap and embarrass the British. And why would you free the grain trade? That's stupid. We should do these other things that I'm writing down. And propping himself up as he became the answer. It took him a while. Fleury's time as Controller General was basically the amount of time it was necessary to get Necker into the ministry. But again, he couldn't become Controller General because he was Swiss, not French. He was commoner, not an aristocrat. And he was a Protestant, not a non-Catholic. But he was widely seen as this financial genius. He joined his, I believe, his uncle's bank when he was a kid and spent 10 years there and eventually became a full partner and then started his own bank. And that bank started to make tons of money by doing, what do you think, loaning money to the crown. He speculates in the grain trade heavily as well, which is probably the reason why Necker doesn't want a free grain trade, because it threw up in his face all of the ways in which he was making money. Now, Necker is an interesting guy because there are those who will call him a con man, and we're going to get into why in a little bit. And I don't think that's true. But he opposed completely the notion of physiocracy and the philosophes' approach to all economic engine power in the nation is rooted in the land. He opposes it completely. He, again, worked through the banks with his uncle. He was very, very good at self-promotion. This whole notion of spending time during the ministries of Turgot and Terre, that he was the solution. He was the, I am a financial, except he wasn't. He was really good at finance, but he wasn't a genius. He had some decent ideas. Some of them are a little sketchy. It looks like he's grinding his teeth. I would be too if I was Necker a couple years from now. So, he had made public attacks against Turgot's ministry about the policies, about everything that was going on that Turgot was doing to break down the internal tariff system. And he becomes the man in charge, basically, of French finances in 1777. He would have been banned from chat for self-promo. Pretty much. He agreed again with involvement in the American Revolution. An involvement which required far more loans, troops, than was originally prescribed by Vergennes. But there's Vergennes, now with an ally on the finance side, that they still are committed to the American Revolution. Still convincing. This is important. French participation in the American Revolution is not vested in Louis XVI. Right? We've talked about, and we're going to keep talking about, his vacillation, his inability to stick to his guns and hold to a policy and force what needs to be done. It's not him that's doing it. It's not him that's driving through and saying, sure, let's get involved with America because what the king wants. He's got powerful ministers now allied together behind that concept. And so Necker and Vergennes and various others continue to drive the point home that we need to stay involved. More loans means less money, because if you're taking out more loans, yes, you are increasing not only the principal but the interest without reforming the means in which you gain revenue. You bring that tax revenue in. So, Necker, I'm going to say this in advance of the next topic, which is the compte rendu. Necker was financially smart. And for those of you that don't understand the way even modern economics works, let's use the United States as an example because it's the one I'm most familiar with. I do try to present things from a world perspective, but it's the one I'm the most conversant in. United States, the economy of the United States is rooted in the concept of a revolving national debt, right? Where as long as you pay the interest on that debt and your GDP, your gross domestic product, continues to go up, you will be able to facilitate paying off that interest, sometimes pay off the principal, and take out more loans and then pay off that debt from the perspective of the principal. Necker probably thought that he was taking France in that direction. He was modeling it off of the Bank of England, which came about after the restored monarchy at the end of the English Civil Wars, where they established this concept of a revolving national debt that we make sure we pay the interest on to keep our credit intact so we can go get more money. France's credit at this point in history in 1777 is bad, real bad. But Necker is a banker. He's a guy who's in with the bankers. So his reputation, more so than France's credit rating, becomes the engine driving the French economy for a time. Because if someone looked at the real books of France, they'd have been like, no, you cannot buy this used car because there's no way in heck we're going to give you a loan. But Necker would say, I've looked at the books. I'm a financial genius after all. So of course, you know me. You know I know what I'm doing. Give us the loan. And the banks will be like, okay, because it was Necker. And he had spent this time in Turgot's ministry building this political presence on top of his long history as a successful banker. So Necker gets this model that's based off the Bank of England's revolving debt, the same basic model that a lot of modern economies work off of. He gets that idea rolling. And then he convinces the king that what they should do is produce a document for the kingdom that shows them how well off the finances are. And it's called the Compte Rendu. It's a book that effectively is the ledgers and the explanations of finances, the money that's coming in and the expenditures, except that Necker, when he produces the Compte Rendu in 1781, and we're now into the last decade of the French Ancien Regime, when he produces the Compte Rendu in 1781, he has broken up expenses in the way he runs the finances of France into two basic categories: extraordinary and ordinary expenses. Ordinary expenses are things that they have to pay, like interest on loans. Extraordinary expenses are things they don't have to pay right now, like the principal on loans. So when Necker produces the Compte Rendu in 1781, guess what's not in it? Anybody. You like fondue, cheese dipping is awesome. I agree, Five Fist. I like dipping cheese too. But the Compte Rendu, when published in 1781, can you guess what type of expenses are not in that book? All of the extraordinary expenses. Exactly, Crackle's got it. Only the ordinary expenses are in. And to Necker, I believe it made sense. Because again, he's trying to take France, I think, and this is me supposing, there's nothing written that suggests this, but if you look at the evidence and his background in banking, I believe he is trying to take France into this revolving national debt model. And he's producing a document that suggests that's how he sees it, which is the only way you can really apologize for it, because, you know, shady and con man are the only other ways to explain it. Like he was cooking the books for his own benefit, or he really wanted to get France on a revolving national debt system that required a national banking system, etc. So when this is produced and Necker leaves out all of the extraordinary expenses, it shows that France has a budget surplus of 10 million livres, which is ridiculous because their liabilities were like a quarter of their income at that point. And it was going to get worse because guess why? They're taking out loans to fight the British and help the Americans, among many other things. But the major thing that creates this massive budget deficit at this time is continuing to finance the American war. The publication of it was only the ordinary expenses, the regular cost of government versus its revenue. Regular cost of government, meaning the bills I have to pay the minimum on against.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
We're bringing in. It did not account for any long-term liability, like loan balances, only the interest. And here's the tricky part. Necker, one sec. Necker, again, I believe, was probably had more integrity than most historians give him credit for in his approach to this. But this publication of this book is the first time in history that any monarchy has said, here, everybody, have a look at the books. There are authors in France 20 years from now in this timeline who will look back and say, I learned to read from the Compte Rendu. It becomes this financial Bible on the soundness of French finances for everybody. People like the members of the Parlement who say, oh, look at how well we're doing. And the subsequent people who would come in and try to be convinced that things aren't really as good as Necker said they were. And they, well, how could that be? The ministry approved it. Everyone's read it. This book says we're not broke. And so the timing of Necker trying to get France off of this mercantile system, this tragic system of lines everywhere as lines financially, and into a modern economic system of revolving national debt as an engine for growth. It backfires because he didn't tell anybody he was doing that. Because he wanted everyone to think he was a genius. And he has to resign in 1781, the same year that he puts it out, because everybody reads it and says, well, look at this financial genius who was only director of finances, not controller general. Walks into the upper ministry and Louis XVI's office and says, I gotta be in. You gotta put me in the inner circle. I'm indispensable. Look at how well this has been received and how well I'm doing. And look at how much money we've got. Of course we have this much money. It's in the Compte Rendu. And intrigue within the ministry, people who didn't like that Necker was a Protestant and a commoner and not French, convinced Louis XVI to say, and they called his bluff. And Necker, being the proud guy he was, and anybody really, if they went to their boss and say, and I can empathize with this, promote me or I'm gone. Well, they said no. And Necker said, okay, I'm gone. So the year that he produces this document would be, which would become this foundational argument point about the state of French finances. Here it is, next guy. I didn't write in the margin what I was up to. And so there's a period in history where everyone goes, man, that guy was a con man. Because those, when they actually go back historically and look at the numbers, like, he was lying. It really depends on your point of view, as Obi-Wan Kenobi would say. It really depends on, do you understand his intent? And I did mess up, and I'm going to fix it now. Fleury was not before Necker, he was after. The person who was there before Necker was Jean-Étienne Bernard Augier de Cluny. He's a historical non-entity. You don't need to know his name. Will not be on the test. But Fleury, I'm sorry, is the guy who inherits Necker's mess. And that's why I put him in the credit. That is a heck of a name. Jean-Étienne Bernard Augier de Cluny. And I have a list of French finance ministers over here so I can look real quick and get names. There's no way I can remember them all and how to pronounce them. Fleury comes in 1781, takes over for the quickly vacated office of Necker with no concept of what Necker was up to. Looks at the books, the true interpretation of the books within the mercantile system at the time, and says, holy crap, we are so in debt and we can't pay the bills. And Fleury was a conservative guy. He was anti-enlightenment. He pushed through, guess what? Remember the VATM? Who remembers what the VATM was from last week? You got 15 seconds to type out just a quick snippet of what the VATM was.
Boy.
Were you paying attention last week? Tax on goods? No, sir. Rockets got it. 5% income tax. 5% wealth tax is what the VATM was. That did not have exceptions. So it made the people who had the money pay some money. Got it pushed through somehow, even though the Compte Rendu is sitting there, looking everyone in the face, saying,
Yes, I'm excited about the guillotine.
even though the Comte Rendu is sitting there staring everyone in the face saying, we've got a bunch of money, Fleury manages to get this VATM in. And the VATM will expire, this third VATM in French history will expire in 1786. So 1781 to 1786, there's a 5-year period where annually everyone in France has to pay a 5% wealth tax, and then how much they get is depends still on the tax farming system. The VATM that was enacted, only the amount of money that was going to be brought in over that period of 5 years, the amount was only capable of covering the interest on the existing loans. That's how bad French finances were in 1781 when Necker is voluntarily kicks himself out of his job. Because they could only get that much revenue from the VATM, Fleury has to take out more loans. He also starts selling venal offices again. And if you remember venal offices, they are buy your way into a job, buy your way into the aristocracy, which is, going back to the first topic tonight, how many of the magistrates in these parlements originally got their job. And the Comte Rendu made it impossible politically to even begin discussions with anyone about raising taxes. Because why the heck do you need to raise taxes? There's a $10 million surplus, or 10 million livres surplus sitting in the royal treasury. I've got a book right here that says so. Fleury gets the honorable mention in the credits today because he inherits this super impossible situation and it doesn't implode on him immediately. Are we too deep in a ditch? Let's get ourselves some dirt by digging deeper. That is a very good analogy, Gilly. So, Fleury lasts, believe it or not, longer than Necker's first act, but it's less influential. The big thing he gets done is that third VATM. He leaves the ministry in 1783, and this is when the true road to the French Revolution begins. The stage is very much set for where this revolution was not unavoidable, right? There were many opportunities had people in power looked at the reality of things and said, holy crap, we need to reform things. But because of the power of the Parlement, their own naked self-interest, the weakness of the monarch who's currently in charge, the disinterest of the prior monarchs, the tactics of prior finance ministers, the wick on the bomb is very much near detonation. We are going to come back and talk about this man. Charles Alexandre de Calonne. Very important guy in French history. Not as important as Necker, but he's up there. He'll be important for one episode. He's not a guy you're going to care about next week, but you're going to care about him this week. The road to revolution really becomes unavoidable, not due to him, but during his reign as Controller General of France. Invented macaroons? No. So, we'll come back in a few minutes and talk about how Calonne tries, fails, and eventually sets the stage for the demise of the Ancien regime. Stand up, take a break, go to the bathroom, get a drink. The last chapter of tonight's episode begins when I come back, as we burn from the start of Calonne's ministry to the beginning of and first phases of what is known as the Assembly of Notables. I'll talk to you guys in a few minutes.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Let's rock!
Welcome back. So, a couple things before we move into Calonne. You'll notice the flag behind me, and I'm going to try to do this as we move through history. I'm going to try to get a couple flags that you may not know and go, what's that? Hopefully someone's noticed that there's basically the 13 stripes of the United States and the British Union Jack. Does anybody know where that flag's from? Not a test or anything like that, just curious if anybody's ever seen it, understands its origin. And while you guys ponder that question, we'll take a step back. I'll give you the answer here in a moment. Take a step back to Necker for a second. Necker, when he left office with this extremely influential book, right, that everyone believed. And when he, a commoner, put his foot down to aristocrats in the ministry and said, I want in, and they said no, this man, this financial genius, who had just given the French people their first look ever historically into the finances of the ministry and the monarchy, he becomes this martyr to them because he was so smart and had unfreed the grain trade, making sure the price of bread was stable, and had stood up to the big bosses. And even though it meant he lost, he was still made into a hero by the common people. He spends the next portion of time publicly defending the VATM. Despite what's about to happen, Necker is out there, no longer a member of the ministry, but now a private citizen, back to running banks, pointing to his compte rendu, saying, I don't know what they're talking about. What I gave you was the truth. And it endears him to everybody in the Third Estate. But Charles Alexandre de Calonne, who I will just call Calonne, Calonne. The flag, by the way, is the flag that was flown in many, many places in the American colonies before the Declaration of Independence. It was representative of colonial America probably until the beginning of the 1770s. If you go to Williamsburg in Virginia, which represents prior to that period of time, you'll see this flag flying everywhere. That's where it comes from. We're going to get into some more flags here next week, especially the origin of the modern French flag. But I thought it was a cool idea, and as I identify flags that I either already own or can acquire easily and give you that visual representation, I will. But I thought it was something I could just kind of throw in. Okay. Calonne becomes Controller General of France when Fleury departs in 1783. The French Revolution begins, based on different people's interpretations, with the fall of the Bastille, but generally around the end of the 1780s. I believe that the French Revolution begins right around now. So Calonne comes into office and looks at the books and goes, holy crap, what the heck was Necker talking about? We are now spending 1/4 to 1/3, approaching 1/2 of revenue brought in on debt servicing, paying off interest, paying off principal to loans we have to pay because they had a term. He does something that's rather unique. When you have to pay down debt, the general approach in the modern economic engine is tighten your belt buckle, right? Save some money. Don't spend, money you don't have on things you don't need. That's the general idea, right? Somebody say right, so I know chat's still there. Is chat still there? There we go. Rocket's still there. So, what Calonne does is the exact opposite for a specific reason. He knows that if he turns around and says, we need to take out more loans, Necker's reputation is not there. And Fleury spent pretty much the last of the political capital that he could in order to get the last round of loans in 1782 and 1783. So Calonne decides that he's gonna bluff the banks by telling the king to spend lavishly in something that is called useful splendor. Convince the world we have money because we spend money. So, it's the idea to demonstrate solvency through spending. And everyone in chat's going, what? Because of course it didn't work. It worked for a period of time, but not a very long period of time. Calonne knew that raising taxes was a political non-starter because the VATM is still out there and the Compte Rendu is still out there, and there is no place for him to stand politically and say, of course we have to raise taxes. Look at my books. They're not Necker's books. No one was going to believe him, and he knew it. Not sure why. Sounds reasonable, says Fee. So, he knew pushing for any sort of tax reform was not something that the king was going to have the spine for. And he knew at this point that if tax reform, which was almost surely going to mean the creation of new taxes, if he pushed for that, it was going to mean that the Estates General were going to need to be called. Because remember, in legal speak in France, if you want to create a new tax, not manipulate the existing ones, you have to have the Estates General call, which is election of officials and representatives from across all three estates meeting and then giving recommendations, which are pretty much binding to the ministry and the monarchy and saying, do this. And the problem with that is no one on the ministry side wants the Estates General called because it means they lose control. So, Calonne convinces Louis XVI in 1783 to spend money to convince the banks that we have money, which we don't have. It was the only way, besides to continue borrowing and then hope the loans that they took out were at lower rates. It was the only way to buy time so that they could take out more loans and get hopefully lower rates so that they could pay off the interest and begin to pay down principal on the lower interest rate loans so that they could get lower interest rate loans and continue to wind down. So Calonne was trying to do debt consolidation in a sense, where he was trying to take all the bad loans and get them paid off with this window he thought he had bought himself and get him to a place where he had smaller loans with lower interest, which meant less pressure for debt relief services on the French economy. However, in 1785, in December, here they come. The Paris Parlement looks at what Calonne is doing and says, here's your remonstrance. You cannot get that loan. Because this whole time, they have had to approve every single loan that's been taken out in the same way we described in the first section. And there's Calonne now strapped with the debt from useful splendor and no ability to do what he's trying to do. The third VATM expires January 1st, 1786. So about a month after Paris Parlement says, no more loans for you, sir. The single economic engine in the French economy that was paying off the interest is over. Pause for this rapid laughter. At this point, the crown begins to run a 100 million livre deficit, which is about a third of their total revenue. Once the new loan interest from Fleury and Calonne kicks in, they start spending about half of all revenue on servicing their debts. When this happens, these two events, the remonstrance from the Paris Parlement in conjunction with the expiration of the third Vatican, it grinds the wheels to a halt. And I believe this is the moment that the French Revolution truly begins. This becomes the tipping point. You cannot get back from the unavoidable trigger catalyst for this series of connected events that are no longer within the control of the men in charge of France to get out of. It was not something they could stop at this point. The financial problem is what starts the French Revolution, not look at the United States and what they're doing. So, at this point, the question is, how did France avoid getting absorbed by another country? Oh, that's a great question. That is the next 30 years of French history, which we're going to do. It's a great question. Let's start off with, in the very first episode, there was a man mentioned in the credits that he really wanted a war. Go figure out who that was, because it's going to matter. And then there's this other guy, this short dead dude that's going to come along later on and not only defend France's borders, but expand them to Russia. We're going to talk about the makeup of Europe at this time in history at the start of next week so that you guys understand where we're going. But it's a great question. Everything that happens pretty much 1783 to 1813. Argofanor. Can I just call you Argos at work? Thank you very much for the follow. Welcome in. Hopefully you're enjoying history. He also, no, he doesn't. That's Neapolitan, not Napoleon, and that's going to be a running joke, and I get it. But let's not confuse the fact that Napoleon did not invent ice cream. But basically, from 1783 till the Treaty of Vienna, which ends Napoleon after Waterloo, is how does France avoid getting absorbed by another country? Didn't the British, that's a great question from number 98. Didn't the British just start the rumor that he was short? He was about 5'10". He's about 5'8", according to most. It varies. I see 5'6" to 5'10", and I land in the middle. He wasn't 5'2", that's for sure. He wasn't short, but we have to maintain the Bill and Ted reference, so he's a short dead dude. Ziggy Piggy, indeed. He was of average height. He was absolutely of average height. We're going to get to Napoleon. Let's not spend too much more time on Napoleon. He's going to have his whole own series. So, back to Calonne. When they realize that they are now going to have to spend half their revenue on debt servicing, the wheels of the ministry from his office stop. Everyone outside is not aware yet. And this is Calonne's first grand mistake. He contains the information of the grave state of France's finances to a very select few. The king, obviously, the people that work in his office and ministry, obviously, some very specific confidants. Remember in the credits, this guy named Talleyrand. Talleyrand is one of the people that Calonne brings in at a point coming up very soon to have a look at how bad things are. Talleyrand's not one of these guys that's just gonna do things for the common good the nicest way possible. He's seriously one of my favorite people in history. We'll probably spend part of an episode down the road here talking about him, like rewind the tape and bring through what he did because it's just easier that way. But his first major appearance in French history is now, in this era of Calonne, as we run up to the Assembly of Notables. So, what Calonne does, is begin working on a plan to overhaul everything. And again, the major first misstep is he tells very few people, very few other ministers about it. Vergennes knows.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Who is still, believe it or not, the foreign minister of France. He has survived Turgot. He has survived Necker, Fleury, Jean-Étienne Bernard Ogier de Cluny, and now he's working with Calonne. That's how much of a rock Vergennes is to Louis XVI. And he is made aware and begins to work with Calonne. So, this reform package would touch every single aspect of the ancien regime. It would ruffle every feather of every person in the ancien regime. And he knew, Calonne knew, that the king did not have the will or the juice to do this on his own. That he could not hand this to the king and say, here you go, here's the package. Take this to the Parlement. And then if they refuse to do it, use the lit de justice to make it happen. He knew that, one, Louis didn't have the political capital to do it, and two, he most certainly did not have the spine that an enlightened despot would need to do it, because Louis XVI is no Frederick the Great. So what Calonne does, in consultation with Vergennes, is convince the king to call what is called the Assembly of Notables. The Assembly of Notables had not been called for basically about as much time as the Estates General haven't been called. It's a very good analogy for Louis XVI thinking. All it took was a slight breeze to change his mind, or the slightest ripple of the most recent ripple of discontent. So, the Assembly of Notables, as it was called in December 1786, because Calonne knew the moment that the Parlement said, no sir, no thank you to your loan, the Vatican was expiring, he immediately began working on the plan and worked with Vergennes and got the assembly called. It would meet in February of 1787. Now that rings a bell from my history classes. The Assembly of Notables was comprised of 144 members. 7 of them were the princes of the blood, meaning the blood relatives of the king who were somewhere in the middle of all things in the line of succession somehow. 14 of the most influential bishops of France. 36 great nobles, including the Marquis de Lafayette and Talleyrand. There was an array of municipal leaders and magistrates and judges, and the whole point of the Assembly of Notables was for Calonne to walk in and say, here's my plan, spend some time reviewing it. Please march out after you've reviewed it as good soldiers of the crown and evangelize it to the Parlement, to the people, and tell them that this is the only way to save everything. It was effectively a council built to rubber stamp and defer to the king. And that is the exact opposite of what happened. Calonne and Vergennes, ironically, both fall ill in January of 1787, which is why they didn't meet until February of 1787. And wait for it, only one of them survives their illness, and it's not the political rock of Louis's ministry. The Comte de Vergennes dies in January 1787, leaving Calonne all by himself, recovering from illness, to walk into the Assembly of Notables and say, here you go. Sorry, I've been sick, fellas. This is the plan. And he doesn't have the most trusted minister in France standing next to him to do it. And at this point, you just have to look at what's happened and go, holy crap. Most revolutions are backed into, and I wouldn't say the French Revolution was backed into, but it surely is a victim of a series of unfortunate events. So, because he was sick, the package is assembled in a very haphazard manner. It contains the necessary facts, but it is not professional in its final completed form. And this is when Talleyrand comes in and is reviewing it with Calonne, and he goes, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but why are you writing this in crayon effectively? Like, this makes sense, but do you understand how this is going to look politically? But Calonne couldn't wait. He couldn't take any more time. He needed to get the fixes rolling. So, as I said, Calonne mishandled the initial point by refusing to involve the other ministers. So when this council, this assembly of notables begins in February 1787, Calonne walks in the door, recovering from illness with a haphazardly but thoughtful plan, puts it down in front of a group of people from whom he was expecting zero scrutiny. So when this group says, wait a minute, you mean to tell us you called us all here because we're in deep crap financial? How can it be that bad? How can the finances be this bad? Because here's the compte rendu. Just a couple years ago, we were in great shape. And Necker's out there telling us publicly how great we're doing. What do you mean we're 100 million livres in the red? And so Calonne's taken back by this. And the assembly demands to see the books. The ministers, who he didn't tell what was going on, demand to see the books. And Calonne, in all of his post-sickness wisdom, with his mishmash of papers on the desk that looks like somebody kind of threw it together, even though he didn't, it made sense, says, no, you're not allowed to see the books, because I'm the Controller General, and the kings looked at them, and that should be good enough for you guys, so shut up, because that's going to be the way to do things. So, the ministers, who Calonne kept out and in the dark for the 2.5 months that he worked on things, started to find it very politically convenient to simply oppose him, because the idea floating around that would gain traction was that the numbers he was presenting were false because he refused to show the books. And this was more an exercise to save Calonne from his own mistakes of things like useful splendor. But everybody generally agreed that reform was needed. The notables all kind of said, yeah, we know we've been getting away with murder by not paying taxes on our land. Sometimes the motivation for the opposition during this assembly comes from enlightened self-interest, and sometimes it comes from just extreme naked self-interest, because some of these nobles are members of the Parlement somewhere out there. And they would continue to claim that the compte rendu was this document of truth, when really is, but it isn't, right? It is, in a modern sense, a representation of fact, but in the sense of the mercantile system, it was a fraud. And Calonne would claim it to be fraud. He would stand in front of everyone and say, Necker's full of crap. Here, I'm telling you, without showing you the books, that we're 100 million livres in debt. Necker, who publicly published the books, is wrong. Guess how well that went over? So, the reform package that Calonne presented was broken into 4 basic sections. The first, so in order to review them, the assembly broke into 7 committees, each one headed by one of those princes of the blood, and there would be a minister of the royal ministry that served as recording secretary for all of these individual committee deliberations. The same ministers who Calonne has said, I don't want to tell you what's going on. So they could provide no insight to the committee's deliberations because they hadn't been told and now perceive their best interest to oppose Calonne. The first section, uniform land tax, no exceptions, which everyone basically said, yep, that makes sense. We know we've been getting away with it. It was problematic because the proposed tax was open-ended. It did not have an expiration date like the VATM. He wasn't talking about just altering the existing tie, that land tax that 43% of land didn't get taxed on. He was talking about a new tax that would scale basically potentially into infinity in terms of the potential revenue it could gather. And it removed all potential for exemption from everybody. And this is the first point where one of the members of the assembly stands up and says, this is not an old tax, you're making a new tax. And if you want this new tax, you have to call the Estates General to get it. The delegates of the assembly who were more from the provinces saw that the next part of this was going to be a problem for them. In order to collect this and other taxes more effectively, Calonne proposed removing the tax farming system and introducing a system of provincial assemblies, that whose responsibility it was to effectively gather the tax. Like, he wanted to create provincial IRS offices. The provincial parlement said, whoa, wait a minute. What? It feels a whole lot like you're putting another assembly out there, like Mapeau did. I don't like it. So there was opposition growing on that point. The Paris Parlement was like, yeah, that makes sense. But none of the other ones were. Because the Paris Parlement wasn't really concerned about losing their power at this point. This tax was designed to be a tax in kind. And for those of you that are not familiar with the term tax in kind, it meant that the land would be assessed based on how much it yielded, not how much it was worth. And then if you produced, 1,000 bushels of wheat, you could pay your taxes in a percentage of that wheat instead of paying it in money, because the ministry would take it and they would use it, and that they could use it to keep its expenses down instead of, just taking money from someone. Problem is that the provincial assembly would be staffed bottom up by a system that ignored the three estates, meaning the best person for the job would get the job. As crazy as that sounds. And even screaming liberals, like the liberal nobles, were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, Lafayette stands up at this point and says, that you're crazy, buddy. You can't just ignore the three estates. And then church property would also get taxed. And the bishops present said, yeah, we're okay with that. As long as you don't touch the tithe, that 10%, I can tax anybody, forced taxation from the church. As long as you don't touch that, we'll pay taxes on the land. So Section 2 includes basically the adoption of the physiocrat platform that Terre and Turgot would espouse, Turgot especially. Freeing the grain trade, removing the internal customs barriers again, making a single frontier tariff, those basic common sense concepts that you have been hearing about for almost 2 decades of what France needed still were not fully in place. And Calonne saying, yeah, we need to do this. We have to do this. And it really wasn't widely opposed. The third section covered management of crown land, which was massively mismanaged. Financially mismanaged, staffing, everything about it was just bad. It was about reforming how the crown managed its own land. And the fourth was basically just a bag of revenue and expense items to demonstrate how all of this could balance the books and get them out of the rears and save the economy and save the regime. Resistance starts from this guy, Etienne Charles de Lomanie de Brienne, who I will simply call Brienne, Brienne, for Gilly. Brienne was one of those bishops. He was elected president of the Assembly of Notables and led the primary opposition to Calonne. The criticisms about the section regarding the establishment of those tax collection assemblies was largely rooted, again, in the protection of provincial privilege. No, not Brienne of Tarth, Archie. Lomanie de Brienne. This guy. But the other part that was problematic is because they did not have time to elect members, the best person for the job, ignoring the three estates. Wait for it, the king would appoint members to these provincial assemblies that would collect the taxes. And that's what they were intended to do. But every member of a provincial parlement was like, whoa, not only do you want to create a new powerful assembly right next to ours out there on the fringes of France, you're telling me that you're going to basically stock them chock full of king's appointees who would owe their jobs to the king, of course, until elections are held. And everyone out in the provinces that had anything to do with the Assembly of Notables smelled a rat, even though there really wasn't one. The salt tax would go away as a part of all of these tax reforms, and it would leave a 60 million livre deficit in customs duties on the ministry. Yep. So, Calonne proposes that really bad compromise that effectively everyone would have to buy salt at a set rate up to a certain amount, and then they would have to buy it at market rate, which screws over the commoners because they've already seen what the free market can do to them. They don't know it because these deliberations are not public, but it also screws over the nobles because now all of a sudden they have to pay a salt tax they weren't paying. And they didn't really like that much. So, the big undoing of Calonne is that he was not a people person, as evidenced by, you can't look at my books. I am the actor on behalf of the king financially. That's that. And he slowly, over time, becomes the problem to the notables. They believe that most of the stuff he's talking about is probably pretty good, needs to happen, but because it's Calonne, led very harshly by Brienne and those ministers who he didn't bring into the system early enough, they start to talk about Calonne being the problem, and it comes to a head during the debate over Section 3, when they're talking about the reform of management of crown lands, because Calonne had been engaged in sale of crown lands. Combine that with the fact that Calonne looks like he's cooking the books to these people, and they seize on it, and they say, whoa, wait a minute, this benefits you, just like everything else in here seems a little fishy, because how are we this badly off? The public opinion's a bad way to say it. The opinion of Calonne within the notables erodes, and eventually this guy, Brienne, slips a note to Queen Marie Antoinette that says, we're basically on board. Well, we think we can go out there and do this, but it can't be Calonne. Calonne can't be the guy that handles this for you anymore. So along the same time frame, Calonne is just getting fed up, right? He's like, why are we dragging our feet? This needs done. All you're doing is arguing with me. And he appeals publicly after asking the king to come down, and guess what? King wouldn't come down and intervene in the assembly on his behalf, even though he said he would, because the king now has the note from Brienne that says Calonne's the problem, and the king hangs Calonne out to dry. So Calonne goes out to the public and says, poor pitiful me, we're broke, and the brakes hit in the French population. They're like, whoa, what do you mean we're broke? I got the compte rendu right here. How is France broke? And it's a major error by Calonne. He doesn't survive it. The notables eventually win. They express their lack of confidence more generally to the king and Calonne. And Louis caves to the pressure, and on Easter 1787, so like 2 months after the assembly is put together, Calonne is shown the door. Guess who the next finance minister of France will be? It's this guy. It's Brienne. He takes over because he was the opposition. Just like Necker was the opposition to Turgot, Brienne is the opposition to Calonne, and he says, I can get this through for you. Just put me in an important, powerful position. It's Brienne. He takes over. Brienne takes over during very public calls for someone else to take over. Necker. Everybody wanted Necker to come back in. But the king hated Jacques Necker, primarily because he had specifically ordered Jacques Necker to shut his mouth publicly while the assembly was meeting, and Necker didn't do it. He still sat out there, especially when the news that they were broke hit, and said, "What do you mean we're broke? Look at the the compte rendu I put out there just a few years ago that showed we had a 10 million livre surplus." And because he couldn't shut his mouth, Louis refuses for a time to bring Jacques Necker back into the ministry, and Brienne takes over. Brienne, as Calonne's replacement, takes over the finances, but is not controller general. He takes over a little known committee called the Royal Council of Finances. There's a historical no one who becomes controller general, but it's Brienne that's driving things, because Brienne is in control of the Assembly of Notables. He is the one who is eventually going to have to go to the Parlement and say, "Here you go, we need this done." So eventually the king does come down for review of Section 4, now under Brienne, and he caves on various sections of various aspects of the Section 1 land tax. He caves on limiting its scope and duration. But then turns around and says, "Well, we're going to have to take out more loans, and we're going to have to broaden the stamp tax." And the stamp tax is something that should ring a bell with everyone who's ever studied American history from an American school. Does anyone know what a stamp tax is? And I'll hum the Jeopardy theme again while you type it out in chat. What's a stamp tax? Does anyone know what it is? Because it's not what you think it is. No, not a tax on all goods mailed. It's not like a postage stamp, it's something else. It's not a tax on the importation of a stamp. Only a few more seconds and I'm gonna give you the answer, because no one's coming close. But that's okay, because they don't ever teach us right. The stamp tax is not a postage stamp. It is a ink stamp. Newspaper is close. Paper. Especially paper used by, wait for it, lawyers. No, it is the stamp on official paper. So you and I can go out and buy a ream of printer paper, put it in, fax that form off, sign, and that counts, right? Some notary can go thunk thunk and it's done, right? That's official paper. Seals. Seals is not it. Imagine that in the legal profession, in the modern era, you had to buy all of your paper for use for filing in courts from the crown, because the crown would stamp in ink the royal seal on that paper. And without that royal seal, your paper was no good. It could not be used for lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of functions, like doing business, conducting legal matters. Even receipts required a stamp. It was the vehicle of many monarchies in order to raise revenue by selling official paper, which had to be stamped with that official seal. The same stamp tax type is what the Americans revolted over. Not postage stamp, not wax sealed things, but this ink sealed official paper for official purposes. So everybody in the bourgeoisie is affected by the notion of increasing the burden of the stamp tax. And little does Louis know that he has just created himself a much bigger problem with a much wider group by suggesting the expansion of the stamp tax. Because even though they just sat here and watched the American Revolution start and finish and supported them, and they didn't really get one of the reasons why the Americans did revolt. It was a tax revolt. The stamp tax was a big part of that. So, the king also directed Brienne to open the books to the notables. And holy crap, they all believed Brienne and got behind him, because here's the king saying the books are legit. Imagine if Calonne had done that instead of being obstinate and arrogant. If he had walked in and they said, "Show us the books," he'd be like, "Sure, here you go." Brienne does it less than 2 months after the Assembly of Notables starts. And if Calonne had done it, Calonne would probably still have been Controller General of France at this point. It wouldn't have mattered. Brienne, Calonne, they'd have run into the same problems. Brienne would largely push the same reform package as Calonne, and he would fail pretty much just as equally as Calonne probably would have, because they have to take this package, which has now faced public scrutiny through the fact that Calonne went public with his discontent with the assembly, and now Brienne has to fight for the package by taking it to the Parlement. This whole episode has been about setting up that fight between the Parlement and their self-interest, as none of them are going to want to give up their tax privileges, even though all these nobles generally agree to it. But the rumblings that have come out of this assembly that were not supposed to be present, the disagreement when it was supposed to be an assembly that rubber stamps things for the king, they don't effectively go out and evangelize because they disagreed so much and then so publicly. And then at the same time as basically Calonne is transferring to Brienne, a situation develops in the Netherlands, the Austrian Netherlands. For those of you that don't know what the Austrian Netherlands are in 1787, it's Belgium. It's just this satellite piece of the Austrian Empire that they can't walk to because it's across the French border. They acquired this territory and they don't want it, but the Prussians invade. And it's a natural thing for the world to believe that France will intervene because it shares a border with the Austrian Netherlands. But Brienne looks at the king and says, we can't afford it. You know why? We have to get this internal problem taken care of. We can't pay for a war with Prussia or to defend the Netherlands. And then Europe says, what? France doesn't mobilize to defend the Netherlands. And that's when everyone goes, what's going on in France? Like the world says, what is going on in France? So next week, we will pick up with Brienne taking the package to the Parlement and the battles that are fought there, and the formation of the calls to get the Estates General going, and then the battle from the bourgeoisie to have that assembly of the Estates General take a very, very distinct form, very different from the last time it was called. We're also going to talk about basically what's Europe up to, because you're going to start to need to understand the basic makeup of Europe and its alliances and who's in charge of what areas. And then we'll get into that assembly of notables and how it only really lasted 2 whole days before something else happened. So tune in next week for that. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this episode and have seen why last week was so critical to understanding the beginning of this story. Brienne is going to last a little while, but not much longer. He's going to lose, but the Parlement is going to lose too. There are no winners in the fight that's coming. So, enjoy yourselves tonight, because it's test time. But before test time, let me know what you think of everything we've covered this evening. Everyone's kind of like, yeah, my brain's fried, Fix. Thank you very much. Way too much information as always. Silence. Awesome. Okay. Test time then. This is how this is going to work. I went back. Well, I really haven't completely gone back, but I will be tabulating, not only giving out free packs of cards for correct answers during the test, but I will be tabulating a long-term leaderboard across the entire French Revolution.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Make sure you clonk that follow button if you've enjoyed yourself tonight. You can't do ABC. No. But at the end of the French Revolution, so at the end of episode 1.x, when Napoleon is appointed consul for life. Actually, no, we're going to do that at the coup of... oh, that's the other thing I needed to correct. The The coup of Brumaire does not occur in 1787, but 1797, but 1799. When we get to that point, we will tally up who is the big winner. And I am going to engineer a leaderboard that you can bring up over my face. You can see who's running in the lead from last week. It will not be live. And then next week, the leaderboard will be there. So if you've gotten an answer correct, and you are the grand winner at the end of the French Revolution, you can pick any, and I mean any, item from the store, the merch store. If you're unaware of it, we have one. But exclamation point merch if you want to know how to get there. But you can pick any item from the store. Be willing to give me your mailing address, and I will send you that one item. That's the place right there. Thank you, Doc. So, I will get last week's question correct answerers, and then combine them with this week's and get the leaderboard going. And long term, you could win a piece of merch. Some of that merch is worth it sells for like $50. So, up to you what you get. So, the test. We did this last week. Let me get this set up again correctly for this week. It will be the first correct answer that appears in the chat as I see it. So let me get you off the screen and bring you over. There we go. The first question is, how many distinct parlements were there in 1787, 1789? Rocket with 13. That is the correct answer. Let me get over to that screen and give you a free pack of cards. That was an easy one. Right? Easy question to start off the test. Rocket's all like, I'm on this now. I want a shirt. Gift pack. Rocket. There we go. One free pack of cards for Rocket on the way and sent. Let me go back in time and find a harder question that might give you. What is it called when the Parlement says, no, I don't think so. We are not registering your edict. It goes something. It's not it. That's not the name of it, though. Crap is also not the correct answer. Told you to bring notebook. I said the word at least 7 times tonight. Rendo, nope. 5, nope, that's not it. You do know now, Rocket, what is it? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It is called a remonstrance. When the Crown, and I'm not going to count for spelling here, when the Crown says, I don't like your remonstrance. I am going to overrule your remonstrance through my royal will by issuing this. What is it called? It was politically inconvenient because it made the king look like a tyrant. Nope, not remonster. That was the other one. Remonstrance was when they say no to the king, and the king comes back with this to overrule them. Oh, you guys are not paying, you're not writing things down. Shame. So far, Rocket's the only one's got an answer right. I said it's pronounced like this, but it's spelled exactly the same as a word in English. The Lee de 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the lit de justice is what the king would use to overcome a remonstrance by the Parlement. Gonna matter. The reason I'm saying these things twice and 10 times. Okie dokie. Who was the last Lord Chancellor of France? Last name's good enough. Mapeau. Rocket gets it. Give Rocket another set of cards. Very good. Alrighty. Mapeau. He was the last Lord Chancellor, and then he was First Minister of France. But who did he bring in as the Controller General of France under him. Last name will work. Nope, not Brienne. That skinny, frail dude is also not the answer. Nectaire is not it. Nikolai is actually Mapeau's name. It's Mapeau's full name is René Nicolas de Mapeau. He worked hand in hand with the Controller General, who he brought into the ministry to do two things primarily: take aim at noble tax privileges and reform tax farming. Something Clarice later on, no sir. Joseph Marie Terre is who Mapeau brought in. Terre was replaced by a man in 1774 named Henri Robert Jacques Turgot, who primarily ran his ministry based out of one kind of New Age economic philosophy, which was about the wealth of a nation being rooted in the agriculture and land. What is the name of that philosophy? I knew it was close to my screen name, but I forgot it. The economic philosophy that Henri Robert Jacques Turgot believed in, that was, among other things, designed to free the grain trade, rooted in the idea that all wealth was rooted in the land of a nation, is called what? Everyone's like, man, didn't write enough things down. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's called physiocracy, and those who believed it were called physiocrats. All right, we'll give you one that's easier. As a part of the physiocrat platform that Turgot implemented, which freed the grain train, remember how the harvests are really bad? And some areas were good and some areas were bad, and there was price gouging going on. It led to something, a war, even though it was just a peasant uprising. What was that war called in 1775? The Flower War. Rocket is correct. Doc right behind her, but Rocket is first. Rocket well in the lead now for sure. Okie dokie. What was the name of the foreign minister of France who was Louis XVI's political rock, who also died right before the Assembly of Notables? Nope. Not Vignette. Started with a V. Not Vignette. Not close enough to be the name. As I spelled the name. Not Vignette. Anybody else want to hazard a guess? 10. Not macaroon, no. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Comte de Vergennes, Vergenne. Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes. Alrighty, last question. This one will be an easy one. What was the misguided policy of spending to show that you have money when you don't called that Calonne employed at the start of his ministry? Anybody? In order to demonstrate to the banks that we have money, we're going to spend money, even though we don't have that money, so that we can get some loans from you because we don't have any money. But we want you to believe we have it, not called lavish something. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 2. Afforded Splendor. I'm gonna give the answer to Cracklejacks because he got the last word correct. Useful Splendor, the term. Crackle gets a pack. I will count that. Yeah, that. Crackle gets 1. I'm writing down in the book now. Okay, that's it. That is the end of the episode. You will notice that the next page of my notebook is... I have to write some more stuff this week to get episode 1.3 going. 1.3 is almost certainly going to be called the National Assembly, even though I've not really used that word too much. Or were you, Gilly? You supposedly took notes. So thank you all for hanging out with me tonight.
Yes, I'm excited about the guillotine.
Well, maybe Gilly would have got a few. All right, so any feedback you guys have, I know that this is running almost as long as last week's episode, but they will be shorter moving forward in an effort. They will also pick up tempo. It was necessary to lay this longer narrative groundwork this week, on top of the foundational information from the past, basically, week plus 20 minutes, so that you understand why people react the way they react as we start rolling. I am certainly going to pick the pace up because the events will become those tornadoes we spoke about in episode 1.1. This financial crisis being the first one. So hopefully... Oh yeah, Poe, how are you doing? Poe had the curse of the appendix. I had it last year. Poe had his out very recently. You're doing okay though? I'm glad you're enjoying it. I'm glad you all decided to show up and hang out and have fun with me tonight. But that will be the end of episode 1.2. Again, I really, really appreciate you all supporting this. It is not easy to throw together all this. It's just a lot. So thank you all for being here. Let's figure out who we're going to raid while we wind things down here and I close out 18 tabs of pictures of French individuals. Let's see. Who is out there in Twitch land that we can send some traffic to? Woozle is playing music right now, and we have a fair amount of people here watching. So my friend Woozle Effect, where we're going to go. He is a very good gentleman and a good friend. I would suggest you hang out for the simple fact that he can play. He has an improvised guitar which is made of a 50 caliber ammo can. And he'll take your requests if you hang out and play the songs off his list on a guitar made of a 50 caliber ammo can. Richie Cranium, welcome in. You did make it right at the end, fortunately, but it was a good episode and it'll be on YouTube in a couple of hours when it uploads. Again, I really appreciate you all being here. We're going to go hang out with Woozle, go enjoy his music, give the guy a follow, hang out. He's super personable. He is a great harmonica player, and he calls his show Recycled Sound because his instruments are made of recycled things. There's some cigar box instruments. There's lots of interesting stuff. The neck of the 50 caliber ammo can guitar is a hockey stick, by the way. Just really cool stuff. So hang out with us as we head over to Woozle. I appreciate your attention, your time, and your love of history tonight. And I will catch you, hopefully, for Darkest Dungeon this Wednesday. Things at work have calmed down, and almost for sure, assuming I get the outline done, but I will confirm, but planning on doing 1.3 of Heavy Metal History next Saturday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Oh yeah, the toaster. He's got an instrument made out of a toaster, too. It's really cool. All right. We're out of here. Thank you all for being here.
It is time.
I really appreciate everybody. Seriously. Can't say it enough. How much all of you being here drives me to keep doing this. Hopefully you found the start of the story entertaining, eye-opening, and confusing, because it is confusing. We will talk to you all. And everyone else who streamed, I love you all. We're Legion. Be excellent to each other. And I'll talk to you all later.
Be excellent to each other. Party on, dude.
to each other.